Today's video is called Diagnose Before You Prescribe. The best way to describe the content is by saying telling isn't selling, but asking questions is. One of the key things I often hear about why people are successful in sales is the expression, the gift of the gab. So people talk about, that guy John, he was always made for sales because he's got the gift of the gab. What the science behind selling really says is selling isn't about the gift of the gab. What it's about is about the ability to get the other party talking and not so much be talking yourself. So to kick this video off around questions, I want to talk about Socrates. Socrates was a scholar, a philosopher, and a teacher. And on the teaching front, one of the things that was really unique about Socrates was that invariably he never answered the questions of his students. So a student would ask a question and Socrates would ask a question as an answer. It would often be a very carefully phrased question, but he would ask a question as an answer. So why did he do that? Well, one of Socrates' sayings was that I can't really teach anyone anything. All that I can do is make people think. So what he was doing in that technique with his teaching was he was encouraging people to think through the problem, think through using some powers of deduction around what the answer might be. And as they came back to him, he would ask another question to lead them ultimately to the right answer. And selling is very much like that. If Socrates was a salesperson, he'd be the top guy in any firm probably. So questions is really important. Questioning skills are really important because what they do is they engage the prospect or the customer, and really good questioning makes people think through their situation. So there's different types of questions. We'll talk about a couple of question models. Let's firstly talk about open and closed questions, which is a really simple one that everyone watching this video probably knows about. The first thing around open questions is an open question really has to be answered not with one word or a couple of words, but with a sentence or more. A closed question, which isn't necessarily a bad question. Closed questions are equally useful, but they generally require a one or a two-word answer. So if you want some straight facts, closed questions are really good. If you want people to tell you more broadly around a situation, then you might use open questions. So how do we phrase a closed question? Closed questions typically may start with the word who, where, or when. And open questions would often start with the words how, why, or what. Because if you think about any question that starts with a how, it's requiring sentences, it's requiring some detail, and it's requiring the person on the other end of the question to describe the current situation. So getting to situation, we use a questioning model, and there's many around which I've referred to in some of the other videos, and there'll be others going forward. Ultimately, the different questioning models are reasonably similar, and the purpose is reasonably similar. We use a simple model called SOS, and the first S stands for situation. So what's really important in selling is that we diagnose before we prescribe. And maybe to give you a really very current situation around this as we're filming this video is that in Australia now we've got the virus out and about, and people starting to get very nervous about it, and if they have certain symptoms, they're being recommended to very quickly go and see their GP or a specialist and get diagnosed. When you went to see that GP, the GP wouldn't just take your temperature and take a quick look at you and say, hey, you're okay. The GP would firstly ask you a whole series of questions, and in fact the health department in Australia and all over the world has prescribed the questions that the doctors must ask so that they can prescribe effectively and correctly. So the questions might be, hey Wayne, how old are you? Why how old? Well, because people over 60 are more susceptible to the virus really seriously impacting their health. And what do you do for a job, Wayne? And that would be related maybe to, am I with people a lot? Do I travel? Have I traveled recently, and where did I travel to? Was that domestic or was that international? And when was that? And when did you leave? And what did you do over there? And around the symptoms, how long have you had the symptoms? Can you describe them exactly? And he would dig into the symptoms. So the doctor would do a detailed diagnosis, and around selling, it's exactly the same. If we don't do the diagnosis, the customer or the prospect will not feel as comfortable because they feel that you really haven't teased out what the issue is, the challenge is, the situation is, and you really haven't maybe learnt too much about their business, and maybe you're assuming too many things. When I was about 20, maybe 21, I took my first overseas trip to Bali, as most Aussies do, and it was a surfing trip. And we went over on a limited budget with a few mates, and we lived there pretty cheap. I'd never been overseas before, and I was told when you go to Bali, don't drink the water, don't eat the food from the street vendors because you'll get Bali belly, etc., etc. I've been there about a week. I think we went over for maybe 12 or 13 days or 14 days, something like that. And after a week, I started to feel really sick in the middle of one night and a lot of pain. I won't go into the symptoms and so on and so forth because it got pretty messy, but all I will say is, I felt really ill. And my mates are having a bit of fun with me because they've been Bali before and so on and so forth. But after a couple of days, I was still really crook, and the guy said to me, okay, we'll find a doctor. There's a doctor down in the village, and we were staying in pretty rudimentary village in huts and stuff, and we'll get you diagnosed. I paid some money to see this local doctor who spoke absolutely no English. No offence, Indonesian guy. He was dressed in a pair of shorts and a pair of thongs, and he had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth with ash on the end of it. And he had a quick conversation with a guide who we knew who was doing the interpreter, and after about 30 seconds, he said out loud in English, Bali belly. Bali belly, 3 days, all good. I wasn't really convinced around the diagnosis because, number one, of the way things looked. I actually doubted whether the person was a doctor or not. Again, no offence to the individual. And he didn't ask me too many questions and seemed very thorough. Time moved on. There's another 24, 48 hours, I was still crook. I continued to get ribbed by my mates, but finally I said, look, I really don't trust that doctor. It's been 2-3 days now. I want to go home, blah, blah, blah. We asked around and we found that one of the local resorts at Sanua had a doctor on premises, and I paid some exorbitant amount to go and see this doctor at the resort where we weren't staying. And I was put in a room with a bed, with all the medical equipment, beautifully tidy, beautifully clean. In came this immaculately looking doctor, beautifully dressed, handsome guy, 6 foot something, suntanned American with some kind of European accent, very charming, sat me down and went into a really detailed diagnosis. How long have you been here? What have you been doing? Where have you been eating? Have you been washing your hands? Tell us about the amenities where you are. What's the toilet like, and so on and so forth. Asked me lots of questions, did a really thorough examination. Probably this went on for 15 or 20 minutes, and I felt, I'm dealing with a professional here. And then he got to his prescription and he said to me, Wayne, you got Bali belly, and I reckon in about 24 hours you're going to be fine. If not, come back and see me. So I got exactly the same diagnosis from the second doctor as compared to the Indonesian doctor, but I felt a lot more comfortable about the diagnosis. Why was that? That was because probably the aesthetics felt and looked better. The way he was dressed, the amenities, the hotel, feeling I was in a more clean European environment. And secondly, the doctor appeared to take it very seriously and spent good time on me, and I felt was really thorough. I went back to where we were staying, had a sleep that night, woke up in the morning, and I was absolutely fine. So the first doctor was absolutely bang on. He'd seen the situation many times before with Australian tourists. And for him, it was another Australian tourist. He was really confident about his diagnosis. He took it, he asked a few questions, and he said, hey, it's Bali belly. So the first doctor didn't know any less than the second doctor, but because he didn't diagnose me thoroughly, I did not feel comfortable. It's like that with selling. And one of the things that happens with selling when people get experienced is they stop diagnosing because they talk to a customer about a problem they can solve. They've seen the problem many times before, and so they're very quick to diagnose. But in terms of the selling that's gone on, it's not effective because you've been doing more telling, and telling isn't selling, it's asking questions. So it's an interesting story around being diagnosed, but customers and clients want to be diagnosed. They want you to spend the time on doing that. They want you to understand their business, particularly if the investment in your solution is going to be substantial in monetary terms. So the question model, heading back to that, situation questions around facts. They're around basic information that you absolutely need to know. The second type of questions are opportunity questions, and the opportunity questions are really at the heart of the selling. They're generally about what we call the POP. The POP is a problem or an opportunity, a problem we can solve, or an opportunity that we can help the customer create or leverage. So, simple questioning model. I won't spend any more time on that right now, but to say that diagnosis is very important. And one of the things it does is it leads the prospect or the client to what we call self-conclusion. And I think we all know from personal life experience that, sometimes you don't want to be told something that you know is actually right. I mean, you know it's right, but you don't want to be told in a certain way by a certain person. And sometimes it takes you time to be able to think about that, to muse on it, to examine it for a period of time and come to that conclusion yourself. And again, that's what the essence of selling is. It's helping people think through their problems like Socrates did with his students, to think through the situation and to take them on that journey of self-discovery. Not tell them the answer ideally, help them work out what the answer is, and only then start talking about your solution. So what we find is most effective in selling is taking the customer or prospect on what we call the journey of self-conclusion so that they can come to the right answer for themselves with our assistance and our guidance with questions, just like Socrates did with his students. Just one final thing on the questions. Some of the most powerful questions you can ask in selling around opportunities are questions that are around what, how, and why. And we touched on that earlier. To make a point around the questions, the word you start with the question really determines what answer you get. And the way you phrase the question is also really important. So it's not just the questions themselves, it is the phrasing and it's the execution. One thing to be really aware of is why questions. Why questions with customers are really challenging because they can appear to be a little bit critical. And the phrasing of a why question, and I'm just doing this why question to kind of help you understand the importance of thinking about your questions before a meeting and thinking how you will phrase those questions really precisely. In particular, the opportunity and problem questions. So I could ask you as a prospect or a customer, hey Tom, why do you do it that way? Or I could ask a customer, hey Tom, that's interesting. Why do you do it that way? And the question will be received in a very different way and the answer will be different and maybe the detail in the answer will be different depending on how I ask the question. So to close off today, telling isn't selling, asking questions is. And to borrow a piece from Socrates, Socrates said, I can't teach anyone anything, I can only make them think. I would adapt that to selling by saying, I cannot sell anyone anything, I can only make them want to buy.